day everyone. Today we have a really exciting tutorial in which we will walk through the first part to making monochromatic disco balls. So monochromatic just means a single color. Mono means one. And you can do this project using more than one color, but for us, for beginners, we're going to focus on just using one color and then mixing that color with black and white to get a broad range of shades and values. So let's get started.
So you need something to paint on. If you have canvas, great, but I'm going to use this piece of cardboard because I can cut it to make it round like a disco ball. You need whatever paint color you're choosing. You can choose any color you like. I'm going to use this kind of nice pink color, brilliant magenta, but you can use whatever you like, and of course black and white. You also will need a couple of different brushes. A thick one will be nice just for covering large areas, and kind of a medium-sized flat brush for making the mirrors, and a smaller one for lining. Now, if you don't have these exact brushes, it's not a big deal. You can just use whatever you have. Your technique just might be a little bit different. Now, getting started, the first thing you need to do is find something round, like a dinner plate or this big, I've got this big lid, and we need to make our circle so that we can draw our grid. So trace your round object onto your painting surface. And like I said, you can use canvas, cardboard, really anything. I would avoid paper just because it'll ripple when you start to add the acrylic, but start by tracing, and then we can add our grid from there. Drawing the grid is a pretty important but straightforward step. So I like to start at the bottom, and I like to start with sort of a round shape or a half circle. And then each row after is going to be where I'm going to paint my mirrors. So I'm going to draw them in, trying to make them roughly the same thickness all the way along. You don't have to stress too much about this part because we're going to paint over it after. So if it's not beautiful or the lines aren't, they're a little sketchy looking, don't stress too much because we're going to paint over it. So you're going to do this all the way from the bottom up until the top. Some helpful tips for those of you may have noticed, I turn my drawing sideways. I find it a lot easier to make the stripes this way and keep them even than straight up and down like I started. So continually drawing these curved lines, because curved lines is what's going to make our disco ball feel round. So you can see I've tried to make all my stripes roughly the same thickness, and now that I'm at the very top, I will add the last one. Okay, and you can see I'm halfway done my disco ball grid. So now the next step is to add those little segments that will become the little mirrors that exist on a disco ball. So I'm going to start kind of in the middle, and I'm just going to start making lines. And I don't know, I want them, maybe an inch apart, those mirrors nice and big. And so I'm just going to start sectioning those off and try again to make them all about the same width so that your disco ball looks fairly even. You might have some smaller ones on the side. Now, when you do the second row, instead of following the same line, move over and kind of go in the center of the row below. And this is going to offset your mirrors, making it look a little more realistic and a little more interesting, almost like a brick wall. Okay, so when I go to do my next row, I go in the middle of the rectangle above it and kind of draw my lines. And again, these don't have to be beautiful because we're going to paint over a lot of this anyway. Okay, and I'm going to go up, and you're going to do this again until your whole disco ball is completely filled in. Fantastic. So now that my disco ball grid is ready, now I can start to think about the exciting part, which is going to be adding in some of the background color. All right, let's get started.
Now that we're ready to paint, we need to think about a reference image. So what are we going to use? So I have this great picture of a disco ball that we can use to make our painting. So in order to start painting, we need to understand the light areas, the dark areas, and those middle kind of gray middle range areas. So I have this reference image, and
I thought I would kind of edit it a little bit to help everyone see how to see the ranges in there. So let's start by picking out some of the dark areas. And this doesn't have to be beautiful, but it's just to help you understand. So I am going to sort of start to highlight or outline some of the blackest, if you will, blackest areas of the disco ball. And I'm just doing this to really help myself see. So when I start to paint, I know where my darkest areas are and then my lightest areas. And it will really help make my painting feel a little bit more alive. Okay, so those are sort of my darkest areas. When I step back at this and I look, that's what I see, kind of the darkest areas. Now, I have some really light areas that you can highlight. So I've got some really light, where those highlights really are. And a few really shiny areas. So I'm going to highlight those in green just so that when I go to paint, I can kind of see what I'm looking for. So there's a bit here. And then maybe down here. And now when I look at this, the rest of everything that I didn't circle is kind of that gray area. I mean, it varies a little bit, right? There's some varying shades of gray, but I've got my lights and my darks and now my grays. So now I can use this image to start to block in my background color. So let's work on that. Getting started with painting, the first thing we want to do is do what's called blocking in, or blocking in our background color. So it's basically adding underpainting before we start any of the mirrors and the details. So I can see my reference photo that I highlighted the dark, light, and kind of gray areas. I've got my paint with a little bit of white and black, and my cardboard. So the very first thing I'm going to do is this kind of out of the bottle color, I'm going to call my gray, my middle range. I'm not lightening it. I'm not darkening it. It's going to be these gray areas. So I'm going to take a little bit of that paint with the biggest brush I can find and just gently start to brush it over my disco ball. Now, because I haven't cut this out yet, I'm not super worried if I go out of the lines. Now, this paint is really thick. For this, you want to make sure that you can actually see your drawing through the paint. So if it's too thick, just get a tiny bit of water and mix it in, the water down your paint just a little bit for this step, only because we want to add color without covering up our drawing. So I'm going to just start with a really light coat of my middle range color. So I'm not lightening it, I'm not darkening it. This is what I will call my gray. Okay, so do that really quick, and then the next step will be to add those light and dark areas. And the reason for this underpainting is so that when we do start to add the little mirrors and those nice details on top, it will really help this feel round and dynamic, right? Because we've got kind of those realistic light and dark areas happening. Okay, so you can see it's a nice thin coat. I've watered down my paint quite a lot just so that when this kind of dries, I can still see my pencil underneath, which is what I want. So now I've got my base color. Now I can start to look at very specifically where are the dark and where are the light areas. So it doesn't matter whether you start with light or dark. Maybe I'll start with light. So I'm going to take a little bit of the pink and a little bit of the white and sort of just mix it together. And we're going to do a lot more of this later with the mirrors, but for now I'm just blocking in. So now where's my light? Well, where did I highlight green? I've got a little bit up here. I've got a little bit kind of in the middle here. And you can see I'm just going over really quick and it's sort of blending the middle color with my lighter color. And again, it doesn't really matter how perfect this is because we're going to paint the details over top. So I'm just looking at my image. Where are the lightest spots? And just blocking those in. And I've got a little bit kind of down here. Okay, awesome. All right, so now I've got my gray and my light. Now I need my dark. Now, a word of warning. Black is such a powerful color or shade, tint. So grab just a tiny, tiny, tiny bit on your brush when you go to add it to your main color, because you'll see a little bit goes a really long way. So it's easier to add the black to the pink than the other way around, because I would need a whole bottle of pink to lighten up this blob. So grab a little bit of black at a time and mix it. See, now it's too dark. So I can move over here and just kind of stir around until I'm happy with my kind of dark pink. I don't want it black, I just want it dark pink. Okay, happy with this color. Now I can see I've got a little bit, make it a little bit darker, a little bit of a dark spot here. I've got a little bit of a dark spot here on this side and a little bit here and quite a big section here and down into here. And where else? So it's just a matter of going back to your reference image, kind of having a look. And I think I'm going to end up having troubles because you can see I've painted over a lot of my lines, so I might have to redraw them, but that's not the end of the world because I still have my picture here that I can look at. So it's all good. Okay. All right. So now you can see it's definitely not perfect, but when I look at what I've got here and I look at what I've got here, I can see I have some dark, some highlights, and kind of everything else, that mid-range gray. And if you feel like maybe you put too much of either the dark or the light, you can always go back in. So I feel like maybe this area got a bit too dark. So I'm going to go back in and grab my, let's call it gray tone, that out of the bottle pink, and put some back kind of in the middle because I feel like maybe I got too much. Okay, so don't be afraid to go back and do that if you feel like you kind of mucked up a little bit. It's not a big deal. That's the nice part about this underpainting, is we're still just kind of getting started. I'm feeling pretty happy about the representation of my blocking in. So now this needs to dry so that I can go back and make sure I can see my pencil lines. And once this is dry, then I can really start to add those exciting mirrors, right? I can really add those details and make this feel like a finished disco ball. So stay tuned for the next part and final part and most exciting part of the tutorial, where we get to color blend to add our disco ball mirrors. Now that this is dry and I've cut it out, and you can choose to cut yours out at this point or you can leave it till later, but now we're ready to start painting the mirrors on. So for this part, you're going to need obviously a couple of brushes. I recommend a square brush because it will fit really nicely into these rectangular shapes. If you don't have a square brush, you can use any kind of brush and you'll make it work for you, no problem. You need something to put your paint on. Again, white, black, and your bottle color, your gray, because today we're going to be mixing to cover our underpaint. We're actually going to be putting the individual mirror tiles on our disco ball. And so we're going to need to mix a bunch of different shades of our bottle color. So remember, the color that we put right out of the container is probably our gray. It's kind of our neutral. And then we're going to add a little bit of black to make these darker colors and a little bit of white to make the highlight colors. And we're going to do this a bunch of times because really each one of these mirrors is a little bit different. So we're probably going to remix little bits of this pink over and over and over again. Okay, so it doesn't really matter where you start, but go back to your original reference picture and have a look and say, okay, I think I'm actually going to start with some of my darker areas, which, remembering from the last step, I blocked in and kind of have those visible on my underpainting. So that's going to kind of guide me. All right, I'm going to set this out of the way and maybe put something to protect your work surface, just because painting can get a little bit messy. So I've got some scrap paper. You're going to need some water and probably some paper towel. and even a scrap. So I kept the scrap cardboard that was on the edge of this because I'm going to use that to test. So it's really great to have some kind of scrap lying around, even if it's just paper, so you can test your colors as you're working, just to make sure you're happy with them. All right, so let's get started. Remember, black is a really powerful pigment. So when you're mixing pink with black, take a little bit and take a little bit from the main pile and kind of mix it off to the side. We don't want to mix our whole glob of color. So we just want to mix a little bit off to the side, and you can kind of stir, 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 bring more pink if you need, or more whatever color you're using, more black if you need, and stir until you're happy with kind of the color that you're getting. So I want a fairly dark shade here, so I'm going to give it a good little stir, and then I'm ready to start my first mirror. All right, here we go. So I'm going to start again, probably right about here, and just brush across and filling in that rectangular mirror. Now, don't panic too much about, try to stay in the lines, but don't panic too much if you go out of the lines a little bit, because the very finishing touch is we can add the grout, which is that little space in between the mirrors. We can add that back. Okay, so I'm going to go back into my palette and back into my pink and just sort of keep remixing these dark mirrors as I'm painting. So I'm going to do a few, and you can leave a little bit of a space between the mirrors. You can see the little crack there. That's going to act as the grout. Do you think about a real disco ball? All those little mirrors are kind of stuck together. So you can leave that little line, and it will help kind of guide you as you're painting. So what I'm going to do is do a handful of these darker rectangles, these darker mirrors, and then come back and we'll talk about it a little bit more. But as you're going, don't be afraid to go back into your color, back into the black, because what that's going to do is make each one of these dark squares a little bit different, which is cool because it'll make your final effect really, really interesting. Okay, so go ahead and get started, and we'll come back after some of the dark sections have been taken care of. Okay, I'm going to stop and come back for a moment and just touch base. So I've started to fill in a lot of my dark mirrors, or if I go back to my reference photo, the spots on my disco ball that are the darkest. So I've been looking at that while I'm working. Now it's important to share, I haven't used any white yet. So all I have been doing is using my base color, which is the pink, and the black, and bringing it together a little bit at a time. And you can see the reason for doing that is that each of these squares now ends up being just a tiny bit different, even though they're all dark. So something important to notice, if you look at the original disco ball picture, some of these mirrors actually are kind of partially dark and have a highlight on them. It's because they're mirrors, right? So if you look, some of these mirrors are dark on one corner and light in the other. So what can we do about that? I want to show you these ones on the side are really like that. They're half dark and half light. So you can start by taking your dark color and putting that on the first half of your kind of rectangle mirror. And then what you can do is clean your brush, and you can go back into the lighter color and kind of don't be afraid to turn your canvas if that works for you. And then add that lighter color to the second half of the mirror squares, and you can overlap them. So you want to blend them, go back into your other color, dark light, but you can get a really nice overlapping kind of shade just by going back and forth into your light color and your dark color. And then what that does is it basically gives you two colors on one square. Now, at the end, don't stress too much, because at the very end, the last thing we're going to do is go in and put highlights on some of these mirrors just to make it really feel like it's glittering in the light. But if you have a couple of those mirrors that are dark on one side and light on the other. You can absolutely create that effect using your paint just by going back and forth. Like I said, start here, start with your base color. Okay, go grab a tiny bit of the black, and you can see I'll be able to add it into this one side of my mirror, effectively going from dark on one side to light on the other. Okay, all right, so clean your brush. Now the next step I think is going to be to do those middle grays, which is largely going to be just pink straight from my container. So I'm going to take my pink and I am going to start painting some of those mirrors that are sort of that middle neutral color. They're not super dark, they're not super bright, and I'm going to start there. And feel free to, as you're going, just sort of make this your own. If you want to add now, just start to drag in a tiny bit of white, not too much because we're not doing the light areas yet, but go ahead, right? Start to make these colors interesting, make them your own, and you can do that as you're working. So I'm going to go do a bunch of these middle, kind of pink middle tones, and we'll come back in a few minutes. Time to touch base again. So I'm really happy with the progress so far. You can see I've got a lot of different dark shades mixed, and I have got some of those middle range. They kind of blend in. So different shades of pink. And now I'm starting to introduce some white because my disco ball feels a little flat right now. It feels a little sleepy and it needs some of those shiny mirrors. So this is where you really get to play around with the different colors. Don't be afraid to paint over a piece a second time if you like, but now start to go back in and mix the other way. So now we're going to add a little bit of pink to the white because we really want to brighten up some of those areas where the light is hitting our disco ball or hitting those mirrors, and you want to get almost white in some of those little squares. So go back in, go ahead, don't be afraid to mix everything you got, mix these things all together as you're working. It's really a cool opportunity to do something exciting. So go ahead, start mixing your light colors and bringing those highlights to life. Again, don't be afraid to mix light and dark into one little square just by overlapping those colors. Interesting things can happen there too. So go ahead, work on that, and I'll come back at the end when I've finished painting all my mirrors in, and then we'll have a look and see where to go from there. Fantastic. My mirrors are done. I'm really happy with where I'm at. I went over some of the spots again to make them lighter or darker, and I really feel like I've got some nice balance here and it's starting to shine like an actual mirror ball. So please join me for the very final part in this tutorial, which will be to add the finishing touches, the highlights on the mirrors, the grout lines between the mirrors, to really make this feel round and sparkly like an actual disco ball. Final stage, who's excited? Okay, so this is relatively dry. And as I mentioned in the last video, the final part is to really make this shine. So now we are going to add some highlights. So think about a mirror. If you shone a light off of it, you have some spots in one square that are light and some that are dark. So what we really want to do is add some of those highlights to some of our mirror ball sections. All right, so I recommend a smaller brush and probably some water, because for this, it's really likely we want to water down our paint. If we just start painting hard lines on these, they might look a little harsh. So if the paint is a little bit see-through from the water, that will work really well. So I'm going to start with kind of a lighter color, and you can just pick a few. So you want a lighter color on your square than what's already there. So if I just start kind of glurbing some paint kind of on the side and on the corner, you can see how it's just kind of making a little bit of a mirror excuse me, reflection. So pick a few and do that in a few of the corners. Maybe you just want a little bit of a line. You can make them kind of different shapes if you want. There's not really rules to making the shadows because each reflection will be different, just like in real life. So go back, grab another color of paint. Don't forget to water it down. And then you can start adding some of those mirror reflections in some of the corners of your little panels. And you don't have to do all of them. But definitely just pick a few kind of random. You can do, again, kind of an L shape in the corner, or you could do sort of a bubble shape if you just want a couple of lines. That's okay too. There's not really rules to this. We're just trying to make it look like there's reflections happening on some of our mirrors. And then when you go to do the darker ones, it's up to you. You can do a full contrast. You could take that lighter color and really just do a full contrast over top. And if you like the way that looks, that's brilliant. But if that's too much for you, what you can do is go back to your paint and just mix a slightly darker color. It's still lighter than what's there, but darker than the paint I was just using. Okay, so that's really up to you. So go ahead and just fill in a few highlights on some of your different mirror sections. Again, there you go. That's what it looks like with kind of a darker shade that's still lighter than the original. And again, don't be afraid to loosen that up with water. I like the way it looks when it's a little bit more fluid. And if you mess up, you can always kind of go in with paper towel while it's still wet and kind of remove it. You can always go back and paint over it too, okay? So the nice thing with acrylic, it's not necessarily forever. So go ahead and add some of those reflections, and then we'll come back for the final piece. Perfect. So you can see I've gone in and added those little kind of L shapes or just little lines on the edges of maybe half of the mirrors. You can see, and I've used all different colors because the mirror will shine all different colors. So go ahead and just randomly kind of plop those in there. There's not really a right or wrong way to do this. Just go ahead, and again, I recommend watering down that paint. Okay, so once you're happy with that, it is time for the very last piece of this work. And this is what's going to draw it all together and make it feel finished. So what we're going to do is we've spent all this time painting all these beautiful little mirror squares, but what we need to do is get those grout lines in between them to really stand out. So for this step, you're going to use, if we look at this, we've got somewhere it looks light in between there and somewhere it looks dark in between there. So what we're going to do is go back to our kind of light and dark colors. So here's what I want you to do. Take a little bit of water on a wet brush, a nice skinny little brush, and stir up kind of a darker color. It doesn't have to be black, but just a darker shade. And what you're going to do is now where the paint is lighter, you're going to very gently and very carefully, it doesn't have to be very heavy-handed, you're going to go and paint in. Think about Lego bricks. Think about what Lego looks like. So you're going to go in and put those grout lines, paint them in very carefully in between the lighter colors. So we're using dark paint between the lighter mirrors. Now, once you're kind of done that, and we're going to switch back and forth as we're working, but you can see I've got nice kind of watered down paint so that it flows off my brush well, and it's darker than the squares around it. So go in gentle, you don't have to press very hard because we're just trying to get those grout lines painted back in there so that our mirrors look like mirrors and that they look like they're on there separately, not just one big kind of mush. All right, so you're going to spend some time doing that. Also, as you're going along, you're going to come across some of your mirrors that are darker. Well, we don't want to put dark paint between dark mirrors. So this is where you're going to have to just kind of work along a little bit at a time. And when you get to a section with darker mirrors, like here, you're going to go back in and get a slightly lighter color. So again, water, mix it in because it's going to make your paint flow off your brush, but we want a little bit of a lighter color. Doesn't really matter what color, what shade of pink it is, but we just want it to be lighter and again, loose from the water. So now I'm going to go between my darker mirrors and run this lighter color. Okay, so you're going to continue to do the whole disco ball this way and running light between the dark mirrors and dark between the light mirrors. So it's sort of reverse. And again, there's not really a right or wrong formula to this. You can even switch to like this kind of middle pink if you want. Like there's not a wrong way to do this. We just want to get light color around the dark mirrors, dark around the light mirrors, just to contrast and really make them pop out. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And then we'll come back at the very end and we will be completely finished. And there we are, finished, fantastic, and monochromatic. So be proud of your work, make it your own, and I really hope you enjoyed this monochromatic disco ball tutorial.